Hi, folks. Educator Zach Gordon here, and I'm excited to have Matthew Haines-Young from HumanMade with me. And Matthew has worked on the ustwo project, which we're going to get in, but it serves as a great example of a case study of the WordPress REST API in action, along with some decoupled JavaScript and some great architecture things happening on the back end. So, Matt, thanks for taking some time to chat with us about this project.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Before we get rolling, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and involvement in development and WordPress and your position at HumanMade? Maybe a little bit about HumanMade as a company as well.
Yeah, gosh. So I've been at HumanMade for about nearly 6 years now, so quite a while. I joined after just being a sort of freelance WordPress developer. So back when there was only 3 people working at HumanMade. So I've really felt like I've grown with the company.
You've seen them go through a lot of growth, huh?
Yeah, it's been exciting. Yeah, and I'm a WordPress developer. I work on client projects, and I really sort of am a fairly full stack developer. I'm really interested in both front end and PHP, and particularly I'm interested in building good tools for people to write content. I think that's why I'm excited by WordPress and what we can do with it.
Cool. So tell us a little bit about how this ustwo project came to you all. And for those of you folks listening who don't already know of it as an example, which it does get referenced a lot, maybe a little bit about the project itself, what the plan was and how the WordPress REST API fit into that.
Yeah, so I think, so for anyone that doesn't know, ustwo are, I think they call themselves a product development company. Basically, they build apps and products for people. So that maybe is games that they do for themselves, things like Monument Valley, or they've done some great apps like Dice, which is a sort of ticket booking app, which is really cool. And so, yeah, they build apps, and they've got a huge number of developers and stuff internally. But, this project is their marketing site and kind of was owned by the marketing department. So I think what they really wanted was to build a site that was able to show off their development skills in building those apps, but at the same time was really easy for their marketing department to keep it updated and to keep publishing stuff on there.
Well, that is a combination of interesting worlds. So you have people who would love to have, easy to update content, and then people that want to show off, making it look as cool and show off the everything that could be done. And those are often a tough place to meet in the middle. So did they already have this idea of using WordPress and decoupling it before they came to you or early on in the project, or did you help them approach this in a certain way?
No, they very much came to us because they wanted to build something that was like this. I think that they, after we did a day of REST at the conference in London, I think it was that two years ago now. I think maybe the decision came out of that. Internally, they've got loads of front-end developers that wanted to make this site that felt really happy, and they had really strong opinions over how it should be, and they had people to specialize in interaction design and all of these kind of things, which but yeah, they didn't really care about where the content came from. They just wanted something that was really easy for the people to use. So I think WordPress probably came up quite early in their thought processes, combined with the API. It seemed like a great way to approach it. So we very much went into this project with everyone on the same page. We didn't have to sort of sell it, and it fitted really well with kind of what they wanted to do.
That's great. And we're going to jump into this and get a little bit more technical with how you approached it. But maybe before we do that, from a high level, is this something you've seen common with other projects that you continue to get, or you see other folks going? Do you think there's a trend in this, or in this direction from folks that want kind of what ustwo wanted out of their site?
Yeah, yes and no. I think that there's I've been doing so much work with the REST API recently. Pretty much all my work lately has been on sort of headless and decoupled projects. That said, a lot of these projects have done it in very different ways for very different reasons. So a lot of the reasons that ustwo have done it the way they did are completely not suitable for a lot of other people. So I think it's really interesting that yeah, yes, it's a trend, but also like everyone seems to be very unique.
Interesting. Cool. Well, let's jump into the uniqueness of this project. From a high level, could you explain how this decoupled architecture was working for this particular project?
Um, yeah, so high level, they had their own team, and we joined their team, and me and there was, I think it was mostly just me, but Ryan McHugh helped out a little bit as well, and I suppose that the key thing was that it enabled us to split the teams and work on the things that we were good at, so that their front end were able to work on the front end and I could work on the WordPress side. And at the time, I didn't really know any React, and it's all written in React, so I literally didn't know anything about the front end. It felt really weird, in fact, because I couldn't, if there was a little bug or something, I couldn't go and fix that, whereas I normally would be able to. Like, it was a different repo. I had no
Wow,
access to
truly
that at all.
decoupled. Yeah.
It was a very weird experience to go and work like that, because it's not something I'm so familiar with. But also it was quite liberating, because it meant that we could really focus on the data. So what we did was we drew up a contract, an API contract, which we could use this mock data that they would build the app against the mock data, and I would build the API to deliver data in that same schema. So that was really interesting, and it really allowed us to work really deep, sort of in tandem, really closely together without stepping on each other's toes. And that in some ways that's the kind of the holy grail almost of developers, because the more people you have on the team, then you're always getting under each other's feet. So that was really really cool to work like that.
And how, out of curiosity, did you set up this kind of dummy data to test against? Was it just some hard-coded data? Did you generate some stuff that was cached somewhere, or how did you approach that? Because it seems like that might be something other teams would want to have if approaching this type of project independently with different teams on the front and back end.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, we didn't have anything fancy. I think we just had some JSON documents that we shared around. On other projects since then, there's some tools out there that you can use. I've used something called API where you can define this contract schemas, and you can run tests on the output of my API, and they can build to the endpoints provided by API. So stuff like that's cool. I know there's various other things we looked at. In the end, we never did use anything like this, and it was a relatively simple API, actually. Like, it's not that complex, but if you were building something more complex, I definitely would look into something like that.
Nice. So what did this involve on the back end? I mean, WordPress comes with the API enabled, so it could be argued, oh, just write all the right queries and everything and pull in the data the right way, and you've got it already. So did you have to do customizations to either the default data, setting up new endpoints, and things like that? What did that involve from your end?
Yeah, so actually we built this project, I think, shortly after the initial release into core of the API, which was only the infrastructure and none of the endpoints. They were still available in a plugin. But I think what we decided to do was to build completely custom endpoints. So the reason for this was that we could include exactly the data they needed in exactly the format they needed. So they didn't have to do any processing on their end. Another reason for this was, like, they didn't really, as much as I love WordPress, they weren't sort of, I don't know, didn't want to be tied to it forever. And actually, if they defined their own API, like, theoretically any CMS or any platform can output the data in that format. So if they're going to decouple from WordPress, like, actually maybe it's better for us to write custom endpoints that aren't tied to the sort of WordPress data structure.
Wow, that's a really good thought, and something I hadn't thought about, where if you're decoupling, we think, oh, you could switch out any framework or front end from WordPress's side, but building the front end to be able to switch out the back end as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing, as folks get deeper into using the API, some of these queries can be expensive. just with how much they're pulling in, just because they have to serve so many potential use cases. How did you go about writing your queries? Were there things you were looking at performance-wise and not just, oh, let's just gather this data? Did you refine that process or find ways to improve it as you were working?
Yeah, this was a real problem. I think that the API makes it so easy to just get lots and lots of data. And that was something we ran into with, certainly with the core endpoints in the plugin, was, if you wanted to have all of the images, for example, like you add those as linked data. I think, I can't remember the exact terminology, but basically embeds another request into the main request. And we were found quite quickly, we got some really slow endpoints. So I suppose we built, on their end, they built quite a lot of caching of those requests. So it wasn't hammering the WordPress API all the time. Most of the requests hit cache data on their side. We did some fairly custom tweaks to those endpoints to try and speed them up, returning only the data that we needed to. I think this is one of the advantages as well of the custom endpoints that we ended up using on some of the pages, was because we could just tailor those to actually include only the data we needed. But yeah, it is a really difficult problem.
Interesting. That sounds very smart. As you were doing this, did you begin to think kind of as a team, hey, maybe we should build this in a modular way? We might want this type of query again in the future, this kind of endpoint. Do you see some reuse of those, or was it really just kind of custom forming to what they had? I'm just thinking for other agencies, if they're doing this, it may be something where that could be a helpful approach. I'm curious your thoughts.
So, I think all that hard work is actually done by the API. The best bit for me of the API is the fact that the infrastructure, the code for the infrastructure is really good. And it's really easy to write custom endpoints on top of that. And it makes it really quick to just output some data in the format you need it. So I don't think you need to particularly try and share and reuse too much code, but just don't be afraid of diving in and looking at that.
Nice. All right, so let's shift a little bit and maybe talk about some of the server architecture, because when we have a decoupled setup, there are, we know our WordPress hosting environments pretty well, but then when we decouple it, it could be running on a different server, it could just be in a different directory, it could have a completely different architecture. I'm not sure if server-side JavaScript was involved, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about the server architecture from a very low level, and then we'll get into some of, I know you mentioned caching and bells and whistles between them did exist.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how it's hosted. They hosted this themselves and set everything up themselves, but we did discuss this quite a bit. And I think that the WordPress box is hosted on a fairly small VPS, and I think it is completely locked down, so you can't access this publicly, which was quite good for them, because actually they didn't want to be maintaining WordPress and worrying about the security and things of that. Like, having it completely locked down so there's no public access means that they mitigate a lot of those risks around that. So that was quite interesting. And I don't know whether it was on the same box or remote. I guess it doesn't really matter. They then had another box, which was a Node.js server, and they rendered actually, I think they do some server-side rendering of the React as well.
Yeah. Do you okay, so we did have a slightly different setup. You probably have some Node maybe deploying stuff directly from the server. I assume that there were probably some performance discussions and making sure we get that content served up as best as possible. But then you also mentioned that there was some caching, and maybe just, about this project specifically, but also in general for other folks, if they're designing something that kind of fits this model of a more lockdown WordPress where things could be cached hard, how do you suggest going about that? And then what are some of the pros and cons to taking this approach?
Yeah, well, I think the API is quite difficult to cache, because you're sort of making so many different kinds of requests and including different data in those. But I guess they were making some of the same requests over and over again, get the latest posts. But as I said, they built that into their Node app, whatever they built, so that all the requests, because WordPress was locked down, that means like the front, if you're a visitor to the website, you can't hit the WordPress blocks to make an API request. So they sort of proxy all of those through their Node app and have some caching at that level. I don't know much about that because due to the decoupled nature, I had absolutely no input on how they built that. So yeah.
Well, that was actually going to be one of my questions that skirts into that territory. And I know your work was more on the WordPress side of it, but do you know how? It's interesting that you mentioned they were probably pulling in the calls at the node level, but do you know how they were writing their API calls? I know there are different ways to access the API in JavaScript, or and if was authentication part of that need, or was it just kind of pulling things in?
I don't know much about that. All I do know on the authentication front is that because they'd locked it down by IP, so they whitelisted like their office's IPs or their sort of VPN IPs and also the Node.js server. So everything that was proxied through there, that was fine.
Okay, nice. And you said you do like that approach. It is a kind of smart thing because then other people, you're not maintaining a theme and people potentially pinging your site not as it was intended.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that are kind of missing from WordPress that you kind of start to lose out on, which become really hard. And I don't think we necessarily solved these on the project. Things like previews, which, how do you do that when you've got no concept of authentication?
Yeah, so someone's editing in the back end and they can't necessarily easily preview what that will look like on their site outside of. Interesting. Yeah, so that kind of leads, we could begin wrapping up a little bit. I'm curious if you were, to approach this project again, oftentimes there are things we would do differently about it. From a high level, do you feel it was still a sound and a cool approach that you might take in other instances, or were there little things that you might tweak or do differently with the experience that you've gained from that?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot on the project. I think it played to their strengths. They had, as I said, JavaScript developers, front-end developers, designers that wanted to work as a close-knit team, and they were able to do that. A lot of in the wider WordPress sort of theme market, the idea that you're going to run a separate node server and write everything in React kind of seems quite a lot of work, and I wouldn't recommend it unless that's what you want to do. I've seen other companies doing similar approaches for different kind of business reasons. Simply decoupling the development team when you've got a very large team has a huge amount of benefits. So I do think it's something that I have done again. I will do again. Yeah, I think it's probably a bit more of an extreme use of the API in some respects. Like a lot of people will just use it to sort of sprinkle a little bit on top. But I think that's the nature of an API, is that it's really flexible and it can be used to suit your needs.
I love it. Well, I thank you for sharing all this with you. I want to ask a final question here for folks that are kind of following along, want to consider playing around with this, whether it's just a sprinkling or in depth. What, from the developer side, skill set technologies do you recommend somebody has a good grasp of before they get into this and realize, oh man, maybe I'm in too deep. There's some stuff I didn't realize here, because I'm sure your learning deepened as you were going through a project like this. So is there some advice, some things you could recommend people make sure that they check out or really understand before taking on a project like this?
Gosh, I think like if you're going to do a lot of work with the API, read up about kind of API concepts and theories and try and understand why it's good to do things in a certain way. I mean, I haven't done that much, but I've seen a few talks that have been good and sort of helped me out in that respect. And I think that's definitely something I'd recommend. Just dealing with everything at a sort of data layer, like you don't even touch the browser. I kind of have a I don't know what you call it, a sort of API client for making requests, and you can really like craft those requests and like work on a fairly low level fairly low level. Yeah.
Nice. Well, some good advice, and just thank you again for doing the work you're doing and having it be kind of cutting edge. And it sounds like you're continuing to do API work, so maybe we get you on again and talk about another case study project that you've been involved with.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
All right, love it, man. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, so tune in next time when we get in depth with another case study, examples of the WordPress REST API and JavaScript out there in the real world. Take care.